There is a chair at the end of my dining table that no one else has ever been allowed to sit in, not once, not in 30 years, and I want to start there, because that chair is the whole story if you know how to read it. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 68 years old. I live in the same Lake Town house I have lived in since I was 26, in a county where everyone still knows everyone's people, and for most of my adult life I was a schoolteacher. The kind who taught 3 generations of the same families their multiplication tables. I should start with how it began, because the order matters, and because I have never told this story to anyone the way I am about to tell it now, carefully, and in order, the way you tell something you finally understand. I married Charles Voss when I was 23. He ran the hardware store on Delancey Street that his father had started, a narrow building that smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and he ran it with his oldest friend in the world, a quiet, careful man named Walter Price. Walter had known Charles since they were 7 years old. He was not family, not by blood, but by the time I entered the picture he was already so woven into the fabric of Charles's life that not inviting him to Sunday dinner would have felt like setting an empty plate on purpose. So we didn't. Every Sunday, for 30 years, Walter Price sat in the same chair at the end of my table, and he never once missed it without calling first. That is the boundary I need you to understand from the very start, plainly, because everything else in this story sits on top of it. In 30 years, Walter Price and I never once said a single word to each other that a stranger could have mistaken for anything but ordinary kindness. Nothing happened. Nothing was ever said. That is not the twist of this story. That is the truth of it, all the way through. I should tell you what I looked like on paper back then, because it matters for what comes later. I was a young wife in a small town, the kind of woman who kept her opinions about her marriage to herself and her worries about money folded up small where no one could see them. Charles was a good man but not a careful one, generous to a fault, terrible with the store's books, the sort of person who would extend credit to a stranger on a hard luck story and forget to write it down. Walter was the opposite in every way that mattered to a business. He kept the ledgers. He remembered which supplier owed what. He was the reason the store survived its first bad decade, and I understood that from very early on, in the plain, unremarkable way you understand that the sky is a certain color. He came into our lives as Charles's partner and Charles's friend, and for a long time, that was the entire shape of him to me. I want to be honest about that. I did not fall into anything with my eyes wide open. It crept up on both of us slowly, in 100 small moments so ordinary that neither of us, I think, could have pointed to the one where it started. Sunday dinner was the ritual, and it never changed. He arrived at 4 in the afternoon with a loaf of walnut bread from the bakery on the corner, always walnut, never anything else, because early on I'd mentioned once, in passing, that I liked it, and he had simply never stopped bringing it. He drank his coffee from a chipped blue mug that had, over the years, become understood by everyone in the house to be his, though no one had ever declared it so. He built the children a birdhouse for the maple tree in the yard the summer our daughter Margaret was born, and every spring after that he'd come around and quietly repaint it, without being asked, without mentioning it, so that some years I would only notice the fresh coat weeks later and realize he must have come by on a weekday while I was at the school. Those were the ordinary years. I want you to hold on to the walnut bread, and the blue mug, and the birdhouse, because I promise you they come back. The forbidden shape of it, because there was one, and I won't pretend otherwise, was simple and plainly there from the start, the way a fence line is plainly there even when no one mentions it. Walter was my husband's closest friend and his business partner. Whatever either of us might have felt, underneath the ordinary shape of our days, was not a thing either of us was ever going to act on, because acting on it would have meant betraying the one relationship that structured both of our lives. That was understood without a single conversation about it. It didn't need one. But tension doesn't ask permission to exist just because two people have decided not to act on it, and I would be lying to you if I said I never noticed it building, over years, in the smallest possible increments. There was a summer, our daughter Margaret must have been 9 or 10, when Charles was away for a week at a trade show, and Walter came by to fix a leak under the kitchen sink because I'd mentioned it to him the Sunday before, almost as an aside, The way you mentioned something without really asking for help. He came on a Tuesday evening, and he stayed to eat with the children and me because it had gotten late, and afterward, once the kids were down, we sat on the back porch for a while in the particular quiet of a house that isn't quite empty but feels different when the person who usually fills it is somewhere else. We didn't talk about anything of consequence. We talked about the birdhouse, and about a book he was reading, and at some point there was a silence that went on a beat too long, and he looked at me in a way I had no vocabulary for at the time, and then he looked away and said he should get going, and he did. Nothing happened. I want to be clear about that. Nothing happened. But I sat on that porch alone afterward for a long time, turning the shape of that look over in my mind, and I remember thinking, very distinctly, that I had just witnessed something neither of us had meant to let show. My sister-in-law noticed something too, eventually, the way people do. She cornered me in the kitchen one Thanksgiving, drying a dish with more attention than the dish required, and asked me, without quite looking at me, whether I'd ever thought about what would happen if Charles weren't in the picture. I told her that was a strange thing to ask a woman about her own husband while he was alive and well in the next room, and she let it drop, and I never answered the real question underneath it, because I didn't have an answer. I still don't know, even now, if I'm honest, exactly what I would have said. There were other moments like that, small and deniable, scattered across years rather than months, a hand that rested a half-second too long on the back of a chair I was sitting in, a Christmas gift that was too thoughtful to be casual and too modest to be a declaration, a night he stayed later than the last dinner guest usually did and neither of us moved to end it. I built my own private theories about what it all meant, turning them over on nights I couldn't sleep. I decided, at various points, that it meant everything, and that it meant nothing, and that it meant something in between that didn't have a clean name. I was never sure. I want to say that plainly, because I think it's the most honest thing I can tell you about those years. I did not know, and I still do not fully know, what Walter Price felt for me while my husband was alive. I only knew what he did, which was nothing, over and over, for 30 years. The reason nothing ever happened was not complicated, and I don't think it needs defending, because it was never a villain's reason. Walter loved Charles. Not in the way people mean when they say that carelessly. He loved him the way you love the person who has been beside you since before you had a fully formed self, the way you love someone whose good opinion you would rather die than lose. Whatever else moved underneath the surface of Walter's life, that loyalty sat on top of it like bedrock, and I understood, without ever being told, that betraying Charles was not a temptation Walter was fighting so much as a door he had simply never considered opening. There was one evening, I think of it now as the closest we ever came to the edge of something, when Charles had gone to bed early with a cold, and Walter and I ended up alone at the kitchen table long after dinner, the two of us finishing a bottle of wine we probably shouldn't have opened on a weeknight. The conversation drifted somewhere unguarded, and there was a moment when he reached over to refill my glass and his hand stayed near mine a beat longer than pouring wine requires, and I remember looking up at him and feeling, with total clarity, that we had arrived at a door. I could see it. I think he could too. And then he set the bottle down, and cleared his throat, and asked me how Margaret was doing in school, and the door closed itself so gently that I almost wondered afterward if I had imagined it was ever open at all. We never came that close again. I think we both understood, without saying so, that we had been given a warning about ourselves, and we heeded it. Charles died when he was 51. A heart attack, sudden, on an ordinary Tuesday, at the store, with Walter 20 feet away and unable to do anything about it at all. I was 48. My children were grown or nearly grown. And Walter, I want you to understand this, because it matters for everything after. Walter grieved him like a man who had lost a brother, not like a man whose way had just been cleared. If anything, in the months right after, he pulled further away from me than he had ever been, as though the absence of the one thing that had always kept us honest terrified him more than his own feelings ever had. The Sunday dinners continued, because by then they belonged to the whole family and not just to Charles and me, but Walter came less often, and when he came, he left early, and the blue mug sat unused in the cabinet more Sundays than not. I told myself, in that period, that this was simply how grief moved through a household, that people recalibrate their presence after a death, that it meant nothing beyond what it plainly was. I want to be honest that this is also the story I told myself for years afterward, because it was easier than the alternative, which was wondering whether he was staying away from me on purpose, and why. Life reshaped itself the way it does. Margaret married and had children of her own. My son moved 2 states away for work and came home twice a year. I sold the house's upstairs rooms to quiet and kept teaching until I was 62, and Walter aged the way careful men often do, gradually and then all at once. He kept the store running another decade before he sold his half to a younger man from the next town over, and by the time he was in his mid-70s his knees had gotten bad enough that Sunday dinners became something he had to plan for rather than simply attend. He still came, most weeks. He still brought the walnut bread, though some Sundays now it was the bakery's delivery service that brought it to my door an hour before he arrived, because he could no longer manage the walk from his car. I told myself, across all those years, that what Walter and I had built was a friendship, unusually deep, unusually loyal, but a friendship, nothing more, and that whatever had almost happened at that kitchen table decades earlier had been a single unrepeated moment, a fluke of wine and loneliness, not a window into some larger unspoken truth. That was the story I lived inside of for 30 years. It held up fine, right up until the dinner that broke it open. It happened this past spring, at what should have been an entirely ordinary occasion, my granddaughter Claire's engagement dinner, held at my house because that is where family things are held, with Walter, now 82 and moving slowly with a cane, seated in his chair at the end of the table exactly as he had been for 3 decades. The conversation had turned, as it does at these things, to old family stories, and my son-in-law, half joking, brought up how the family had nearly lost the store twice, once in the early years, and once again shortly after Charles died, when apparently a supplier had called in a debt that should have sunk us. He said it lightly, the way you repeat a piece of family lore you've heard secondhand, and then he said something that stopped the whole table cold, that his own father, who had done some legal work for us years back, had once mentioned that the debt had been quietly settled by an anonymous payment that nobody in the family had ever been told about. I looked at Walter. He was very still, the particular stillness of a man who has been caught holding something he meant to carry alone forever. My daughter Margaret, sharper than I was in that moment, asked the question directly, the way she has always been able to ask questions I could never quite bring myself to. She asked whether he knew anything about it. And Walter, 82 years old, in the chair he had sat in every Sunday for 30 years, set down his fork very carefully, and told the truth, plainly, for the first time in his life. He told us that after Charles died, he had paid off that debt himself, quietly, through a lawyer who never used his name. He told us, in the same unhurried voice, that he had also paid a portion of Margaret's college tuition the year I was too proud to ask anyone for help, routed through a scholarship fund with a name that wasn't his. He told us he had done these things, and others smaller and larger over the years, not because he expected anything, not because he was owed anything, but because it was, in his words, the only way he had ever known how to keep loving a friend who was no longer there to be loved directly, by taking care of what that friend had left behind. The table was silent in a way I had never heard it be silent before. 30 years of Sunday dinners, and I had never once suspected the shape of what had actually been holding this family up underneath the surface of things. It didn't feel like a romantic revelation in that moment. It felt like the floor of my own history quietly giving way, 30 years of a story I thought I understood turning out to have a second, hidden architecture running beneath it the entire time. I didn't say anything to him that night. I don't think I could have, in front of everyone, without it becoming something bigger than either of us had ever allowed it to be. But 2 days later, I drove out to the small assisted care apartment he'd moved into the previous year, and I brought a loaf of walnut bread, because it felt like the only correct thing to bring. He was sitting by the window when I came in, and he didn't look surprised to see me, only tired in a way that had nothing to do with his knees. I asked him, plainly, why he had never told me. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup, an ordinary white one now, not the blue mug, which I noticed and didn't mention, slowly in his hands. He told me that telling me would have made it about something he wanted, and it was never about that. He said that from the day Charles died, he had made himself a private promise never to let anything he did for this family carry a debt back to him, not even the debt of gratitude, because the moment I felt I owed him anything, it would have turned 30 years of restraint into something transactional, and he could not have lived with that. He said he loved Charles too much, still, even now, to let his memory be the price of anything. I asked him, because I finally had to, whether what I had always half suspected on that porch, and at that kitchen table years ago, had been real. He looked at me for a long time before he answered, and when he did, he didn't say the word I think we both understood was sitting in the room with us. He only said that he had never once, in 30 years, regretted staying in that chair at the end of my table instead of anywhere else, and that some things are true whether or not anyone ever says them aloud. I understood him. I think that was the most honest sentence either of us had spoken to the other in 3 decades, and it asked for nothing back. We didn't resolve anything that afternoon, not in the way a story like this is supposed to resolve. I did not tell him I loved him, and he did not tell me. Neither of us reached for the other's hand. We sat by that window for close to 2 hours, talking about ordinary things again, the birdhouse, which still stands in my yard, repainted every spring by my grandson now, who has no idea he's continuing a tradition, and when I left, he walked me to the door slower than he used to, and said he'd see me Sunday, the way he has said it for 30 years. I have thought a great deal, since that dinner, about what to do with what I now know. I am not going to tell you this story ends with us finally together, because it doesn't, and because I think that ending would have cheapened everything that came before it. What changed was not the shape of our lives. What changed was my understanding of them. I set his chair at the head of the table now instead of the end, which is a small thing, and he has never commented on it, but he sat in it without hesitation the first Sunday I moved it, and I think we both understood exactly what that meant without either of us needing to say so. I don't know what to call 30 years of a love that was never spoken and never acted on and never named, even now, even after everything. I only know that it was real, and that it asked for nothing, and that a man loved me for 3 decades in the only language he ever let himself use, in bread brought every Sunday without fail, in a mortgage quietly paid, in a birdhouse repainted every spring by hands I never saw. I used to think restraint like that was a kind of absence. I don't think that anymore. I think it might have been the fullest version of love either of us ever knew how to hold. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.